We want to welcome everybody to this edition of CBAN's Lunch and Learn webcast. I'm Curtis Dean with the CBAN, and we're excited to be here for this presentation. I'll give you all the details in just a minute because we're really excited to have an author of a new book joining us today. And it is a book that is right in CBAN's wheelhouse. It's how to make better broadband available in rural areas and diagnosing some of the issues and challenges that we have and some of the reasons why we don't have it yet. I'm Curtis Dean with CBAN, as I mentioned, and I'll bring Todd Kielkoff in. Todd is our other CBAN co-founder joining us today. Oh. And the man in the middle you see is the topic of today's discussion, Christopher Ali. Christopher, we are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We'll be give you a more formal introduction here in just a minute. Right now, I want to give a little plug to the Community Broadband Action Network, or CBAN Summit. The new CBAN Summit edition is coming up on October 19th, and we are really excited to be able to bring that to everybody. It is going to be held in Johnston, Iowa on October 19th, and it's going to be held at the Stony Creek Hotel. We've got a nice agenda planned. This is the first time we've been able to do this since 2019 for obvious reasons. So we invite our CBAN members and anybody else who's interested to come by. It is free to attend. We're going to have Christopher Mitchell is going to be on the agenda to lead us off. We are Christopher and the folks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance are big allies and helpers when it comes to CBAN. We appreciate their support. And Dazman Lee, or Daz as we call him, will also be there. Daz is new to the ILSR. He is a community advocate. He's actually based here in Iowa. So, and Todd, you'll get to meet Daz tomorrow as he's riding along with us on a project we're working on. So they're going to talk about the state of community broadband in America. Later in the afternoon, we're going to have a community spotlight where we talk to about the project that is going on in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and how that project got across the finish line. So we're really excited about that. My iPad is distracting me. My apologies there. We will, Todd and I, along with Ryan Mail, who is the assistant to the city manager, will talk about the Fort Dodge project, along with HR Green, they're the engineering firm, and a key component of this was the money. So Michael Maloney with DA Davidson will be there to talk about the financing. This is be the biggest municipal broadband project, at least in Iowa, where there wasn't an electric utility involved. The city does not have an electric utility, city of Fort Dodge. So we're excited to share that with everybody. Then we'll have our roundtable discussions on various topics: state and federal funding for broadband, building the buzz for better broadband, conveying the local benefits of public broadband, and the economics of rural broadband networks, which of course are a challenge to meet. So that's the CBAN Summit we're really excited about, and we'd like everybody to join us for that. That is coming up on October 19th, and you can register right now, and the registration is available at our scrolling across the bottom of the screen right now. Just go to broadbandaction.com and you can put in your information and get registered for the CBAN. Sorry about that. We will stop the shameless self-promotion for a minute and get back to our discussion at hand. And that is discussing a new book that is out from this young man right here, Christopher Ali. Christopher, thank you for joining us, and please take a minute and just kind of introduce yourself to everyone. And you know, we kind of in a preview discussion here talked about how you came about writing a book about rural broadband, and it's a really interesting story.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Curtis and CBAN for the wonderful invitation to be here for this Lunch and Learn. Hi to everyone who's watching or will watch this video. It really is a pleasure to be here. My name is Christopher Ali, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. I came to this work in rural broadband kind of circuitously. A lot of my work focuses on local communication. How do we communicate by television? How do we communicate by newspapers? And now, how do we communicate by broadband? The book originally started as a book about farm communication. But then, a few months in, before I even told anybody I was writing a book about broadband, I started to realize that farm broadband fits into a much larger conversation about rural broadband. And there's the cover right there of Farm Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity. A much larger study and a much larger conversation about the role broadband plays in rural America and rural communities, and why we don't have high performance broadband in so many areas of rural America. And on the flip side, what we can do to make that happen collectively through policy and through local digital champions.
Great. Well, I have to confess, and I told you this earlier, due to scheduling, I just have not had a chance to thank you for sending an advance copy to my review. But I got to tell you, you're getting plenty other great reviews from other people, some really smart people out there in the world. I'm just going to highlight one of them as I think I'm going to highlight one of them anyway. Here, let's do this, shall we? Still figuring this out. Well, Doug Dawson's is an old friend and someone that is probably one of the biggest brains in broadband in the country, and he did a review of your book on his blog here recently, and many good things to say about it. I know there have been other great reviews that you've had from people that follow broadband nationwide. So that must make you feel good. And the book is hitting the shelves really soon, or is it today even?
It's today, which makes this conversation so much more exciting. That today, Farm Fresh Broadband is available online, potentially at some also local bookstores. And just as another shameless plug, if anyone listening goes to the Penguin Random House website, you can buy the book and use the code MIT10 for a discount.
All right, which way should I buy it that gets the most money in your pocket? Because you should be rewarded for all your intellectual capital here.
The nature of academic publishing is that our royalties are not amazing. But regardless of how you buy it, so long as you don't buy a used copy, I will get about $1.25 per copy.
All right. Well, very good. We'll make our contribution. I might just do Amazon because I got other things in the cart right now.
Fair.
So
yep.
That'll get
Amazon will work just fine.
Well, Chris, you're kind enough to prepare some slides to kind of talk us through the what the arguments are and behind with the book, and what you've observed, what you've learned in preparing for this book. So I'm going to hand it to you to kind of go through that with us.
Great. All right. So I'm gonna disappear here for a second and turn this on. So I guess a little bit more about myself. At the University of Virginia in Media Studies. I've been here for 9 years. I hold a PhD from the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And my work and my research, I specialize in communication policy and obviously broadband policy and some earlier work about localism and local news. I had the opportunity to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee in March of 2021 about rural broadband programs. So how I really approach broadband and rural broadband is through policy, right? What have policymakers done? What haven't they done, and what they could do better? I've also written about broadband for the New York Times, The Hill, Realtor Magazine, Columbia Journalism Review, and Digital Beat. So the book, Farm Fresh Broadband, is an analysis of federal and state policies regarding the subsidization, deployment, and regulation of broadband to rural communities. And I like to say that the book is a story of failure and a story of success, because a lot of the book actually focuses on how federal policies have largely failed, despite the promise, to bring broadband to rural communities. And I go through a long kind of history of looking at the Federal Communications Commission and USDA and where some of the struggles have been. Why hasn't the $6 billion the federal government spends annually on rural broadband deployment, why hasn't it made a tremendous difference, the difference that we would all want to see? Why are we still having a conversation about high performance broadband in rural America in 2021, right? Shouldn't we have nip this in the bud a decade ago. But it's also, so it might be a story of policy failure, but it's also a story of promise and of community successes. So I spend a lot of time talking about and profiling communities that, in the absence of a large commercial market player or the absence of federal policy support, that they've taken it upon themselves to connect themselves. And this is why a conversation today with the Community Broadband Action Network is so exciting, because the book is a celebration of community broadband, and how municipalities and cooperatives end up being the unsung heroes of broadband in rural America. So I say it's a story of failure and a story of success and promise. The ultimate argument of the book, I'm an academic, so we have to argue something, is that rural broadband policy is both incomplete and it is broken. And it's incomplete and broken because it lacks coordinated federal leadership. So there's a kind of a triangulated fight between the FCC, the USDA, and NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Administration. It's mired in a battle between these regulators, a bewildering array of rules, inconsistent state intervention, the dominance of the large and loud providers, and a policy process that favors the largest providers over hundreds of local, municipal, and cooperative ISPs. So ultimately, yes, are we spending $6 billion a year on broadband, on rural broadband deployment? Yes, we are, but we're not spending it efficiently or democratically. And in the conclusion of the book, I kind of outline what my vision would be. So in terms of how I did this study, like I said, I'm a policy analyst, policy researcher. So I analyzed thousands of pages of policy, over 10,000 pages. I didn't take an exact number, but over 10,000, potentially approaching 20,000 pages of policy documents. I did in-depth interviews with elected officials, with broadband providers, with regulators at the FCC and USDA, for instance, as well. And then, after doing all this, I kind of realized that maybe there's a chance that people don't find broadband policy as absolutely fascinating as I do. Maybe I need to humanize broadband policy because no one else has done it. No one else is kind of, even at the Federal Communications Commission or USDA, we don't have a human face on broadband. So my hound dog, Tuna, and this is Tuna in this selfie, went about what we call the Rural Broadband Road Trip. In the summer of 2018, we drove 4,000 miles across the country, talking to anyone and everyone who would talk to us about broadband, from just kind of people on the street to mayors and county administrators, boards of supervisors, rural broadband providers, farmers, state officials, activists, this incredible array of people who had these amazing experiences or lack of experiences with broadband in rural communities. And this selfie was taken obviously in front of the Jolly Green Giant, which is located in Blue Earth, Minnesota. So this became kind of my stories for the book. And I called this a method of lived policy, right? How is policy actually lived on the ground? So this is a bit of a spoiler alert now, but there are kind of 6 key takeaways from the book, and I'll quickly outline all 6 of them. The first is that there is a strong historical connection between rural electrification in the 1930s and 40s, rural telephony in the 1950s, and rural broadband today, right? In the 1930s, through the New Deal, the government, the Roosevelt government, realized that electricity needs to be a utility for everybody, right? And they went about creating an organization known as the Rural Electrification Administration to make that happen. And within 15 years, over 90% of rural America was connected to the electrical grid, right? So tremendously successful, and had with tremendous vision from the federal government that then empowered local communities to form cooperatives to connect themselves to the grid. And this is what I see we're missing now about broadband. There's a lot of talk about broadband, and certainly the infrastructure package is going to, if it passes the House, is going to offer $42 billion for deployment alone. But we're not seeing, or I'd like to see more, the empowerment of local communities through federal policy. So that's point 1. Point 2 is what I call the politics of good enough. That for decades, federal policy has failed to bring affordable, high-performance broadband to rural America. And instead, what it's done is bring good enough broadband to rural America. DSL connections, satellite connections, dial-up connections, right? We've taken this approach, the federal government has taken an approach that so long as something gets out the door, it's good enough, right? High prices are good enough. Slow speeds are good enough. Bad maps are good enough. So all of this I call the politics of good enough. My third point is that policy at the federal level has largely failed rural America because it privileges the largest and the loudest providers. And an example I give here is that in 2015, when the FCC began what was called the Connect America Fund Phase 2, which is its plan to fund broadband in high cost areas, meaning rural and remote areas, instead of making a competitive auction and instead of really identifying who the players are in local communities, instead what the FCC did is give $1 billion a year to the 10 largest providers.
Mm-hmm.
And in return, they had minimal build out requirements and very little accountability for this money. So we saw a couple of providers not even live up to the expectations, but still got the money in anyways, and sometimes upwards of $500 million a year. So I argue that the FCC has been captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate. Now it just regulates in favor of the industry. So that's called regulatory capture in kind of academic parlance.
So Christopher, not to interrupt you, but is that is a fairly recent phenomenon as far as the FCC and the regulatory capture, which is the perfect way to term it. Isn't that really something that's come about just since the late 80s?
I don't necessarily think so. I think that we saw more kind of public interest regulation, certainly in the 60s and 70s. But when it comes to telecom, the FCC has always, since its creation in 1934, has privileged AT&T, right, as the monopoly telephone provider. And there was very little appetite, at least from the FCC, to discipline AT&T at all. Certainly, the Department of Justice got in the 80s, broke it up. And then in broadcasting, we saw a big move from the privileging of the local station to the privileging of station ownership groups and networks. So yes, I would definitely argue that regulatory capture has ramped up since the 1980s, but I think it's always been there. And I think it's baked into the essence of the Telecommunications Act and the Communications Act before it.
Maybe a little less glaringly obvious.
Yes.
Than it has been the past 20 years or so.
Yes.
I've always wondered if that whole deregulatory wave that came about in the 80s, was part of this transfer of decision making from the federal government to the actual incumbents, where they make the decisions, they write the bills, the FCC nods and goes along with it because they look at them and say, well, they're the experts.
Yes.
And so they defer to their judgment as opposed to pushing back or seeking judgment from other entities such as cooperatives or smaller community-based broadband networks.
I mean, I think that's a great point, right? The FCC tends to overly rely on the voices of the largest providers and undervalue the voices of small providers, right? So large providers say, hey, you know what? We don't like this whole community broadband, municipal broadband thing. And the FCC says, okay, well, we're not going to, after the Wilson and Chattanooga case, we're not going to pursue it any further, right? You guys, we'll leave it up to the states to do what they're going to do rather than another attempt at preemption, for instance.
And of course,
the FCC,
they can afford more. I'm sorry, they can afford more lobbyists than independent telcos, or even the associations that represent community-based broadband networks have a lot less money to spend on politicking than AT&T,
certainly,
Charter, Comcast, any of those folks.
Right. And that comes down to, as someone who has read probably everything the FCC has published on broadband in the last 20 years, I mean, if you look at who gets cited and quoted all the time, it's the big providers, and rarely do we see an opportunity for the voices of the smaller providers and their associations to kind of break through this. I, for one, was really excited when the Biden administration, when they originally announced the infrastructure plan, they had language in there that privileged or underscored or highlighted community broadband, nonprofit broadband, local broadband, cooperative broadband. And even then, that language seems to have disappeared
Yeah.
in the Infrastructure Act that got passed by the Senate. And, it's always really difficult to figure out, okay, how did that language disappear? But we can take a really good bet at who was knocking on the door of the Senate to make that language disappear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Knocking on the door, but they also own the house. So
Well
knocking on the
said.
door,
I like that.
knocking
Knocking
on
on
the
the
door
door,
of their own
knocking
house.
on the house.
Uh,
Yeah.
CBAN, here at CBAN, we were involved a little bit in some of the original crafting of that infrastructure bill through our one of our congresspersons here in Iowa whose office reached out because that Representative Cindy Axne was going to be on that working group inside the House that worked on the infrastructure bill. So we were advocating for some of those things would have allowed more of the funding and the authority to come down to the local level. But like you said, it's the sausage is being made in Washington,
Yes.
and it doesn't always taste very good when it comes out.
No, exactly. And again, back to this idea of how is policy actually lived on the ground, right? If we can put a human and less technical and technological face on broadband, I think it could do a lot to empower local communities for their elected representatives.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point.
So 3 other points, just quickly to run through the points in the book. I think my favorite one is this idea that local broadband is the best broadband, and certainly, this is nothing I have to convince you all of, right? That local communities have connected themselves in the absence of private market or policy help, and this is often done in partnership with a telephone or electric cooperative or a local ISP or other utility. Really exciting here in Virginia, we're starting to see not only electric cooperatives get into retail broadband, but also the large utility providers like Dominion and Appalachian Power open up their middle mile network. So that's something that we've been, a really positive development here in Virginia. The last 2 points, one is a case study I did on fiber to the farm. I couldn't let go of my farm communication. So an entire chapter is dedicated to broadband to the farm. And certainly what I've learned is that high performance broadband is absolutely crucial for contemporary agriculture, but it comes with unacknowledged challenges. And this is where sometimes the hype gets in the way of what can actually be deployed. I mean, in this conversation of the importance of fiber optic and fiber to the home, one thing we forget is that fiber to the farm can only work so long as you have a wireless last mile. Right, you can't, you can imagine a bunch of John Deere tractors with a fiber optic cable plugged into them, right? That's not going to work. So how do we embrace and improve and make more affordable wireless options for farmers and growers in the United States? And what is that relationship between wireless and fiber? So that's something I contemplate. And last but not least, this conversation or this issue of the hype, right? The hype of the new and the next, in particular, 5G and LEO, low Earth orbital satellite. I think we need to critique those who are actually doing the hyping and kind of, if we can cut away some of this clutter of the hype in media, what are the benefits and what are the actual opportunities for rural communities? And one of the things I really worry about is when I talk to communities and they say, well, you know what, 5G is just around the corner for us, or Starlink is just around the corner for us, so we're not going to do any lifting ourselves and we're going to pause our broadband plans because Starlink is just around the corner or 5G is just around the corner. And these conversations really worry me. So part of it becomes, how do we educate and empower community leaders and digital champions to understand these dynamics and make the best decisions with actual information and not just hype on the ground. So that became an unexpected calling for me as I was researching this book and writing this book, and now have the opportunity to work with a lot of communities and counties exactly on this issue. One of the things that came out of the book was an article I wrote called "Everything You Wanted to Know About Broadband Was Afraid to Ask." And it was for county leaders to kind of cut through this clutter of what are the different technologies? Why don't you have broadband? What does mobile broadband mean? What is a wireless option, right? These really, kind of broadband 101 questions so I'm hoping I'm doing my job at cutting through the hype and the clutter.
Well, we often talk about the hype that's associated with the next new thing, 5G, as an example. Starlink will solve all problems. We all know this to be true. We also, but even the traditional or incumbent or legacy or whatever you want to call it, providers utilize that hype as well. I mean,
Oh yeah.
one of the big examples right now is the cable TV industry is out there hyping something they call 10G.
Oh, 10G. Yeah.
Yeah, and talking about 10G is going to solve the problem, and you don't need fiber. This is going to be better than fiber, and yada yada yada. It's not deployed, and it's may still be some years away, but in the consumer's mind, they keep seeing these messages, and it disincentivizes them from taking local action to address the problem today, because they keep being told that if you just wait a little while, we'll solve it for you.
So don't do anything. Don't ruffle the feathers. Don't try and do, God forbid, your own broadband network, or think about these types of alternative partnerships. Just wait for us to do it. And I think another element of the hype is the very definition of broadband, right? We have a lot of players saying 25.3 is good enough, right? When we all know, having lived and living through a pandemic where we're all working on Zoom, that 25.3 is not nearly enough. For our current digital needs, let alone our digital needs in 1, 5, 10 years. So definitely that definition, and this was a rather contentious point when I testified before the Senate. A lot of back and forth around what broadband should be. But again, we got to wonder, who are the ones talking about this? Who are the ones saying 25.3 and 10G and who are saying, well, no, don't do anything different. Just wait for us. And oftentimes it's the large, not oftentimes, always it's the large incumbents.
Yeah.
Well,
so
part of it's just information arbitrage is what I call it. The policymakers are only listening to a little bit of information. And one of the things that we've tried to do in our studies is to broaden the conversation out to multiple users in a household. Age matter, size of being able to just broaden that conversation, just to move beyond, as Curtis has said before, gigabit by press release, because that's our that's kind of one of the things that we think these things do, is just broaden the conversation and add to the library of people saying that it's not just one expert in the local community on this important of a topic.
Yep.
Absolutely. I like that. Those are some great lines. Might have to quote you on that for another book.
Please do.
So again, I'm doing a lot of spoilers for this book, but I think it's really important to kind of walk through what I'm thinking is the next steps. And one of the things I argue is that we need a national rural broadband plan to cut through a lot of this clutter. And we had a plan, actually. We had a national broadband plan that was passed in 2010, which is, kind of largely failed. But we had for 6 months a rural broadband plan that existed in the last 6 months, in 2009, and it was in fact ordered by the 2008 Farm Bill. So I kind of argue that we need to kind of reinvent that for the 21st century. And last but not least, one of the things I want to leave every reader of my book with the idea is that broadband is actually not about technology or companies or policies or money. It's about people. And I think that if particularly policymakers could really understand this, that broadband is lived or not lived in our daily lives, and that's going to go a long way to humanize broadband and why we would need certain speeds, or why we talk about fiber to the home, or a fiber-fueled fixed wireless network, and why we need to have these networks today to anticipate what we're going to need tomorrow. And sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's an excellent point. We talk about experiences. Really, broadband is it is a tool that enables an experience. It is not.
Yes.
It is not the experience itself. If you have it, you can experience these things, like you can work from home effectively. You can educate your kids from home. You can get health care. You can engage in commerce. You can have all those experiences, but you've got to have this tool to do it. And so you're right. If we focus too much on the technology of the tool, I just want to drive the car. I don't want to have to know how to build an engine.
Well, and it also, if we focus too much on the technology, we forget the fact that having just broadband in the ground or in the air doesn't do anything if you don't know how to use it. So we lose that whole aspect
Correct.
of digital inclusion and digital equity that is so vital and gets both under discussed and underfunded, right? Do we need wires in the ground? Yes, we do, but we also need that educational component and that skill set component and that confidence component, right? I mean, one of the heartbreaking things about the pandemic was the fact that people couldn't book their vaccines or their appointments because they didn't know how to confidently navigate
Right.
connectivity and with that kind of digital literacy. So, it's about people, it's about these experiences. It's about the car, but we also have to teach people how to drive, and that's a crucial point that I think gets underplayed. Although it's certainly getting a lot more. A lot more discussion. Certainly, the infrastructure package has great opportunities for digital
Yes.
inclusion. The NDIA, National Digital Inclusion Alliance, is fantastic. Colin Rhinesmith's work is fantastic on these issues. So we're talking about it. There's some great champions there.
There are, and the work that Todd and I have done, and just the people we've talked to over the years, that literacy effort it's going to take a while to overcome some of that.
Definitely.
Because it's a generational thing. It's very much an income thing.
Oh yeah.
When we talk about why don't you have internet at home? Yeah, there's going to be some percentage that say I don't have internet at home because there's no internet here. It's no broadband available, but there's a pretty good chunk of people that say I don't have it because I can't afford
it. Yeah, absolutely. Something I think I read 18% of New York City doesn't have broadband, and that's not an access issue. That's an availability. That's an affordability issue. That's a phenomenal percentage, right? And if we look at the digital divide kind of like holistically, like you said, I mean, we notice that it tracks exactly onto other social divides in our country, right? Who is least likely to have access to broadband? Low income communities, rural communities, tribal communities, minority communities, newcomer communities, immigrant communities, LGBTQ communities. All of these different facets, they kind of coalesce around the digital divide, and so much is about affordability. And there's a big subset that you're absolutely right that do not have access because there are literally no wires in the ground by them. But a much larger population in the United States doesn't access the internet because they can't afford it. Yeah. So we have to make it more affordable. We have to make it more accessible.
And it's affordability. I've always said this when we, over the years, affordability is in the eye of the beholder, right? I can't afford a Lamborghini, but if I really thought it was important that I had a Lamborghini, I could figure out a way to do it.
Right.
I don't have that value, therefore it's not important to me. So we've got to make sure people understand maybe what they're missing so that affordability becomes, it's still a factor, and there's still going to be people that just, they honestly don't have the income to do it. So let's figure out a way to help them. But we've got to make it important enough to other people that they'll figure out a way to make it work for them. Because we all know that, we all have to make choices in our individual budgets, right? And how do we make it so that broadband's a little higher up the choice list than it is for some folks now?
Right, absolutely. And this is where I conclude my book with this line, and there's a typo here. The line is from Bernadette Jocelyn, who's at the Blandin Foundation, not the Bland Foundation in Minnesota. But she told me, it's funny because I live on Bland Circle, so Bland, I don't know, just rolls off the tongue. So I apologize to the Blandin Foundation for this typo here. But I love this idea that everything is better with better broadband. This is something Bernadette told me in an interview for the book. And I conclude the entire book with this line. And if I can beg your indulgence, I would like to read the last paragraph of the book because I think it encapsulates. Thank you. So here it goes. And forgive me, I'm looking down so I can actually read from the book. So everything is better broadband. I repeat it here and throughout this book to shed a clear, bright light on a complex issue. This is not a technologically determinist argument. The mere existence of broadband in rural communities does not correct rural inequality, although the lack of connectivity certainly does not help. Instead, I invoke this phrase to demonstrate how rural broadband and broadband policy are lived and experienced or not on the ground in rural communities throughout the country. Broadband policy, such as it is, may be written in Washington with legal prose refined at the headquarters of AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, Windstream, and Frontier, but it is lived in Laverne, Minnesota, McKee, Kentucky, and Mineral, Virginia. At its farthest reach, Jocelyn's phrase parallels conversations occurring at the United Nations and the European Union about whether internet access can be called a human right, akin to the rights to information, education, and participation. Closer to home, it reminds us that at the end of the day, broadband is not about politics, technology, or money. It is about people. When deployed democratically and harnessed inclusively, everything can be better with better broadband, from homework to work, to voting, to health, to talking with grandma. Everything is better with better broadband is a call to end the rural-urban digital divide and the multitude of digital divides brought on by inequality in the United States. And there you have it. Everything can be better with better broadband.
That's the perfect way to put it. I mean, that's kind of what our CBAN mission has been since we started doing this 3 or 4 years ago, is to help communities be able to identify pathways to better broadband. One of the things that's interesting, and this is something that we're constantly battling, those of us who are in the industry that are advocates for better broadband, is the idea that the only way to evaluate a quality of a broadband connection is how fast it is. And when we all know that there are there are networks out there that are capable of great speeds that are not better because they aren't reliable, they aren't affordable. We talked about that. They're patchy. They're available on this side of the block, but not across the street. And that we need to start our policy makers understanding that these other factors have to be taken into account. So when the only evaluative tool in creating a national broadband map is raw advertised speed, we are missing out on 90% of the equation.
Absolutely, we are. One of the things I talk about with folks is how not all broadband is created equal. And we need to be thinking about the pros and cons in a number of different capacities, certainly not just advertised speed, certainly not advertised speed at all. We can think about, like, DSL literally can rot in the ground. It can be chewed through by animals. It attenuates after 3 miles. Cable suffers from network congestion, so which we've heard time and time again, and it is also using sometimes very old cables as well. I know certainly in my neighborhood in Charlottesville, our cable is quite old, and we suffer from a considerable amount of network congestion. We can talk about the expense of fiber in the ground. We can talk about the potential weather interference of satellite. I mean, there's all these things, and this is why I think it's so important that communities need to know these to be able to make the best choices for themselves, and not have someone else say, well, this is the best and the brightest, and this is what you need to do. We should be working with our communities, empowering our communities to make these choices.
And part of that is just knowledge. If you're the average community leader, city council person, city manager, even, you may know a lot about paving streets, but you don't know anything about broadband. So lifting that information base there is a big part of this, which is, a great reason why, everybody that's watching this should read your book. I've been talking about Susan Crawford's book for the past couple of years. Another excellent book that talks about some of the root causes of the issues we face today and helps understand and demystify it. But policymakers, down at the local level, sometimes they have to juggle a lot of things. And so one of the things we've tried to do with CBAN is try to lower those barriers of information so they can get that information and act on it. So,
well, and that is so absolutely important, because we also know that large providers are acting on it. Right? They have their briefing books ready, and when a community says, or a county or a state says, hey, we need information about broadband, or we know broadband is important, how do we improve it, how do we get it, the first ones through that door, sometimes not even knocking, are large providers with a briefing book of this is why this is why we're the ones who need to be able to do this. And
Yeah.
and so it's not even just about the technology, it's also about the providers themselves. We need greater transparency, certainly, on these these deployment initiatives, and the value and setback of a lot of or the value and challenges of working with different providers.
I want to talk a little bit about RDOF, because a lot of people a whole lot smarter than me have identified that RDOF, the whole process, was a big debacle, and that it is going to end up not resulting in nearly any of the goals being met of that project, of that process. If it comes time for the next RDOF, whether it's out of this infrastructure bill or something new, what do we need to do to make it so that those funds are actually put in the hands of people that are going to build networks and not just rebuy their own stock?
I mean, that's a great question. And I, like so many of us, was really disappointed at how RDOF turned out. It was
a
very
race
clear
to the bottom.
It was absolutely, and the FCC did not. And in the FCC's defense, the new composition of the FCC has kind of done a bit of a mea culpa that they did not do their due diligence. They did not vet the candidates. And it's what's really particularly unfortunate is something like LTD, which giantly over exaggerated the possibilities of fixed wireless. Fixed wireless is an important tool in rural broadband deployment. But what you have is a company that massively over exaggerated the potential for the speed potential, right? Bidding at the gigabit level. And you've got the regulator who's supposed to look out for the public interest, not doing their due diligence. And that was particularly disappointing. So a couple of things that I think we could do better. One is accountability for award winners, right? Both CenturyLink and Frontier did not live up to their 2018 and 2019 commitments for Connect America Fund. Why on earth were they allowed to bid on RDOF if they've already demonstrated? I mean, Frontier's been in bankruptcy. Like, why were they permitted to be part of this?
Right.
Starlink was in beta, still is in beta until I think the end of the month. Why were they allowed to bid when it is unproven at scale? And there's a lot of studies. Granted, I know one's coming from another industry competitor that's saying that that certainly Starlink will not be able to live up to its capacity potential because of it's going to rather hit its capacity without living up to what it promised.
Well,
so
and even Musk himself has admitted this is not a solution. This is a better than nothing solution, and it should be deployed in areas where there are no other options.
Right. But isn't it interesting that Musk went from broadband for everyone to broadband for rural to broadband for some?
Yeah.
Right. You could track that hype over the last 3-4 years of the announcement and the lead up to Starlink. So we need accountability measures. The other thing that we need to see is making sure that smaller providers get a legitimate chance to access this funding and not just the leftovers.
Absolutely.
I know that the Rural Electric Consortium was one of the top winners, which is great to see. But it was one amongst a top 10 of huge industry players like Charter, right?
Right.
Either we need to set aside a substantial amount of money for providers, for small providers, or we need to make sure that they're given a fighting chance at accessing this. I mean, we're talking $20 billion here for RDOF at least, and it will not. I mean, the FCC predicted in 2017 that it would take $80 billion to connect this country with fiber. Right. We've already spent at least $60 billion in the last 12 years.
Yeah.
RDOF is going to spend $20 billion. We should be inches away from closing the infrastructure gap, right? We are nowhere near that. Okay, so accountability, privileging small providers. I would love to see preemption of state laws that prohibit municipal broadband. Get rid of those.
Amen.
I would love to see the establishment of robust state broadband offices. So if you're going to give money to states, every state should have an office. This is kind of one of my concerns with the infrastructure package. And I know I'm going back and forth a little bit, but there's no provision in there that a state has to have a broadband office. And we know, I mean, look at what Minnesota has done. It has an amazing broadband office. It has, it is empowered. It is funded. It's a great staff. Every state should have a robust state broadband office. Okay, states, local, preemption, cooperatives, speed, right? One of the things I was disappointed at with RDOF and was disappointed at with the infrastructure package is that we are still hanging on to this 25.3. And the only rationale I have for why, and I write about this in the book, is because it keeps DSL and satellite in play, because they don't have to prove actual speed, only advertised speed. And DSL, if you're super close to the D-SLAM and it's brand new copper and no one's on the network and it's not a full moon, you can get 25.3, right? So it keeps DSL in the ground, which is awful for rural America.
Yeah, and this split between download and upload speeds is also a dinosaur of an earlier age where you didn't use upload for anything. And now we know we're using upload for we're uploading right now.
Absolutely. And look at what farmers are doing. Farmers are uploading terabytes worth of data. They can't do it on anything less than a symmetric, usually fiber optic line. I've met with a lot of farmers who say what they end up doing is downloading their data onto a USB stick and driving to the closest building that they can get a fiber connection.
Correct.
So that they're not spending 2 days uploading their data. Wouldn't it be amazing if we got all the YouTube influencers to talk about upload speeds because they're making tons of money? Maybe this should be a new campaign for CBAN is getting those influencers talking about upload speeds. They depend on upload speed, and 25.3 ain't going to cut it.
There are a couple that are here that are from Iowa that are big YouTubers that I've been wanting to score a couple of them for a session just about the importance of uploading content and data. And it's not just YouTubers, it's anybody that creates.
It's anyone that creates. Yeah.
And we all know that data usage, the data file that you would have created 10 years ago is infinitesimally smaller than the same amount of data today because everything's more complicated. So whether it's a video or a GIS file or a 3D printing file or whatever, those are essential things that people are doing on a regular basis. And we're still stuck in this 3 megabits per second is adequate mindset. There's always going to be creators are going to be greatly disadvantaged by that.
Yep. And again, rural creators in particular, and those living on tribal land, right? Yeah. One of the things that has stuck with me throughout my research is this line that download is about consumption, upload is about production. Right? So, and I'm just captivated because it's absolutely correct. I mean, one of the reasons why the cable industry touts, the ultra blazing fast download speeds is that cable is also incredibly asymmetric, right?
Yes.
And so they can't tout an upload speed, but what they can do is say you can binge all night and not have network interruption. Well, fine. But you certainly can't, work on a Twitch stream where you're uploading your reactions to things. You certainly can't do, like high capacity live gaming. Right, with 3 megabit per second upload. But that's something we don't talk about. We don't talk about upload enough.
I think that sometimes gamers, I think, could lead the revolution here, right? Because they're very passionate about their gaming. They are very reliant on not only download and upload speeds, but low latency networks, which they are not getting in many cases.
Right.
And, maybe we just need to, we in the industry that advocate for better broadband ought to just bring in the gamers and say, we need you as our army out there to pound on the providers and make them do better.
Yeah, you could call it the Community Broadband Upload Summit. And
there you go.
Bring in gamers and influencers and artists and anyone who creates, anyone who uploads, and farmers, right? Let's build a coalition of farmers and gamers and influencers and visual artists and business folks who are uploading massive Excel files. Yep. And let's go march for
Uploaders Unite.
Uploaders Unite. I love it. It's a new hashtag.
But do you think that some of it is in the Midwest in particular or rural areas are just more pessimistic about that there's an actual economic opportunity to benefit from broadband on the upload side. It's really embedded more in being the type of people who typically live in rural. We live in rural Iowa, so more conservative, traditional. You go to work every day. Those of us that, actually are doing things from our home offices aren't really working in the traditional sense. So how can we make a living using our brains instead of our brawn? I mean, I grew up on a farm, and I think it was, in the farm crisis, it was like you're just hunting down economic opportunities. There's no way you could have dreamed in rural Iowa that you could sit at home and make money off of an internet connection. Where
right.
In the cities, maybe that's just more prevalent because people actually know people who do it.
Yes.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And there's a couple of data points that we could look to, right? Fiber to the home raises a house value by 3%, right? That goes rural and urban. 50% of farm income now comes from non-farming related activities, and a lot of it happens online. It's about Etsy, it's about farmers markets. So there's tremendous capacity there. Not only that, but precision agriculture can improve farm yield by upwards of 10%, right? But you need a high-speed broadband connection or a fixed wireless network for that, or at least 4G, which a lot of communities don't. We know that in rural communities, broadband lowers unemployment, raises GDP. So we have the figures for economic development. And I think that part of the problem is a translation issue. With anyone who's not, reading through pages of policy or technical languages, I think it's our job as advocates to translate all of this to folks who don't have the time or don't have the interest. And I think that should be a calling for all of us, is whenever we do work, how do we translate it to make sure that our work is as accessible as possible? And certainly as an academic, I mean, academia can do so much more to translate our very jargony language. And that's something I really hoped that I accomplished when I set out for this book. I was like, this is going to be a book that everyone can read. Not just a book that my PhD advisory committee would find interest in. They did find it very interesting. I always talk to them, but I want the message to get sent out everywhere.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that's evolving that I think that hasn't become an economic topic yet for broadband has been where you have a lot of these communities, like the community that I live in, never adopted a local option sales tax because we had such resale leakage already that the prevailing economic conservative policy was don't put yourself at a further disadvantage. Well, they adopted one, and so they're getting their first year collections this year, and they adopted one for a larger public purpose, but the retail the amount of online shopping is almost 3 times the collections of what they thought it was going to be allocated to this zip code. And I think that if you start looking at rural Iowa communities, you say, well, yeah, the malls are getting shelled. So we can't, as economic centers, statewide politicians can't talk about that because you have winners and losers. But certainly the rural Iowa ones should be just hammering that the best online shopping experience I can give my consumers benefits here, my local community. So let's make that a priority, whether that's an upload or a download. But that's just emerging issues I think this year that people are starting to just stun at the amount of reverse leakage trend. And it's due to broadband.
Yeah. And, it doesn't have to be sending, in fact, it shouldn't be sending residents to Amazon or Walmart.com, right? I mean, broadband will benefit local businesses in that they can be part of the digital ecosystem in a way that, that wasn't possible without a high-speed connection. And there are so many and this is what kind of I find so vexing, which is that broadband should not be a partisan or political issue. There's something we can all get on board with, right? I mean, rural economic development, small business economic development, education, civic engagement, public safety, public health, quality of life, right? These are universal topics. They're not partisan necessarily. But that's an issue for a different conversation. But it is something that frustrates me when we have these conversations. Why have we made this so partisan, so political?
unfortunately, almost everything has become partisan and political.
Indeed,
in today's society.
Yeah.
Well, certainly how the broadband happens is where the policy has to be artful and tailored. And that's what we have tried to say, is that we are somewhat agnostic about how that happens, as long as the right way happens and it happens for over the long run and not just stopgap.
Yeah.
Right. And what I say in my book is, like, it's all fine to be technologically neutral, but we can't be technologically blind.
Bingo. Yeah.
Good.
And building a network, building out broadband with technologies that will already be outdated in 5 years is a very poor use of not only public capital, but private capital.
For sure.
But unfortunately, we haven't had those consistent policies that dissuade the use of those funds for technology that won't be future ready, so to speak.
Right.
I wanted to go back to one point you made. We were having the conversation about that maybe there's not enough awareness of what broadband is enabling in production. You know, that maybe there's more awareness about that in cities and rural areas. It really just, to me, comes all down to visibility. You know, if you're gonna have 100 jobs created in a rural county, everybody's going to know that's happening, right? They're going to see the building going to go up, that money's coming in from the Economic Development Agency and grants and tax credits and all these things for those 100 jobs. But there might be 100 jobs out there right now, 100 incomes being earned in somebody's living room or basement. And because it's not visible, people aren't aware of it. So it's happening. And we got to make sure that, you know, whatever we do, we have to communicate to people that it is happening. And it will happen more in rural areas if we have access and affordable networks out there to enable it. So
I couldn't agree with you more. You know, one of the things I'm learning with my work with Virginia counties is how little knowledge sharing, best practices, championship is going on between communities and between counties. So every county feels it has to reinvent the wheel. Right. We need to be spreading. And I also agree that, you know, you've been to one community network, I mean, everyone is different. There will be no cookie cutter solution.
Correct.
But there are key takeaways, or, you know, there's something that a Virginia county could learn from an Iowa county, but, you know, which is why, you know, the summits that you are all doing and the summits that we talked about before are so important to spread those messages and spread those words and do that vital knowledge sharing. That maybe there's just a nugget that someone's going to take home, you know, to Missouri or Mississippi, and, you know, all you need is a nugget, right, to get the ball rolling. I'm mixing a lot of my metaphors here.
No, that's the life I live, Christopher, on an average day. You know, there's a quote, I don't know who did it, so I can't attribute it, but I love this quote: "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And even though you have two communities, they may have different circumstances, they're going to have things in common that should allow them to learn from others who've come before them. And like I am always telling people, we want people to learn. We want you to learn from the mistakes of the guy that came before you, or the community that did this 2 years ago, or 5 years, or 20 years ago. So that information sharing, again, something that we're trying to accomplish here with CBAN. Before we go here, I just wanted to bring up one of our comments. Somebody from YouTube wanted to congratulate you on your book.
Thank you.
Has already pre-ordered it. Austin, thanks for the comment. We appreciate that. I'm going to be doing my order here when we get done. I didn't do the pre-order. I apologize that I didn't do the pre-order, Chris. But I barely have time to get on Amazon and check my cart, so much less to actually get the book ordered. Well, any closing thoughts, Christopher, before we wrap it up today?
No, but it did remind me of just one thing. My technologically blind comment, when you were saying it, don't remember who quoted, that's from the NTCA. So I don't want to be taking credit for that.
Gotcha.
This is why it's important to read policy documents. The NTCA said it about a decade ago, and it's just something that I've latched onto, this idea that we should be technologically neutral, because we don't know what's coming down the pipelines in terms of development, but we can't be technologically blind. We can't keep putting outdated technology in the ground. But no, I think for last words, I want to thank you and CBAN and Todd again for this opportunity. Thank you to everyone who's watching and everyone who has thought about buying my book. Please also keep in touch. I'm available email, which is cali@virginia.edu, or on Twitter @Ali_Christopher. You can Google me and find it. Please, one of the things that's been a joy about writing the book is when people reach out to share broadband stories. Yeah. I love it. So if anyone's listening and wants to share their broadband story, please send it my way.
Well, of course, the YouTube is being recorded, and I'll post that onto the comment section once it's ready to go and uploaded to the website. Before we go, real quick, again, shameless self-promotion here. The CBAN Summit coming up October 19th, and there's been a little flurry of registrations today that I've been watching, and we've actually had some people that have not been involved in CBAN before that have signed up to come to the summit on October 19th. And just to mention too, the summit, we hold it in conjunction with the Iowa Association of Municipal Utilities annual municipal broadband conference. So IAMU is on the 20th and 21st. The afternoon of the 19th is CBAN. So people are welcome to come to both events. CBAN is free to CBAN members. And if you're not a member, guess what? That's free too, unless you just want to be an associate member and, a company that sells products or services. So we want to thank again, Christopher. It's been a joy, pleasure having you on today. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
And Todd, thank you for helping me out. And for everybody else, we appreciate you being here and being part of our latest and greatest CBAN Lunch and Learn. Thank you, everybody. We will see you next time.